Hello, ladies and gentlemen, James here. I'm on this page and I wanted to show you about land, about one of the things about the Black American experience, African American experience, and owning land. And I'm going to play a couple of short clips. Hope you can see my screen. But this is where it started at. And continue the last one.
That, of course, is Chris Rock's famous joke about streets named for Martin Luther King Jr., which tend to be in, let's say, distressed areas. And he's not wrong, because if you look at the way housing segregation works in America, you can see how things ended up this way. Once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. Okay, let's look at MLK Boulevard in Baltimore. I want to show you how to see housing segregation in schools, in health, in family wealth, in policing, but first, an explanatory comma. It's the 1930s in the wake of the Great Depression. FDR is president. He wants to bring economic relief to millions of Americans through a collection of federal programs and projects called the New Deal. One part of that New Deal was the National Housing Act of 1934, which introduced ideas like the 30-year mortgage and low fixed interest rates. So now you have all these lower income people who can afford homes, but how do you make sure they don't default on their new mortgages? Enter the Homeowners Loan Corporation. The HOLC created residential security maps, and these maps, they're where the term redlining comes from. Green meant best area, best people, aka businessmen. Blue meant good people like white-collar families. Yellow meant a declining area with working-class families. And red meant detrimental influences, hazardous, like foreign-born people, low-class whites, and most significantly, Negroes. Again and again on these HOLC maps, one of the most consistent criteria for redline neighborhoods is the presence of black and brown people. Let's be clear. Studies show that people who lived in redlined areas were not necessarily more likely to default on their mortgages, but redlining made it difficult, if not impossible, to buy or refinance. So landlords abandon their properties, city services become unreliable, in most places crime increases, and property values drop. All of these conditions fester for 30 years as white people flee to the brand new suburbs popping up all over the country. Many of those suburbs institute rules called covenants that explicitly forbid selling homes to black people, and all of this was perfectly legal. Now it's 1968, and MLK is assassinated.
Good evening. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, 39.
Apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot.
Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight.
In the aftermath, Congress passes the Fair Housing Act of 1968. It's a policy meant to encourage equal housing opportunities regardless of race or religion or national origin, and it offers protections for future homeowners and renters, but it does little to fix the damage already done. Over the next 50 years, the Fair Housing Act is rarely enforced. So, you can still see housing segregation and its effects in Baltimore and often along any MLK Boulevard in any U.S. city, like its effects on wealth. So home ownership is the major way Americans create wealth, right? Well, discrimination in housing is the major reason that black families, up and down the income scale, have a tiny fraction of the family wealth that white families do, even white families with less education and lower incomes. For almost 30 years, 98% of FHA loans were handed out to white borrowers. Not only were black neighborhoods redlined, and not only was the Fair Housing Act selectively enforced, if at all, but it is still, today, much harder for a black person to get a mortgage or home loan than it is for a white person.
Families are fearful of speaking up about a basic human right that should be afforded to everyone in the world, but definitely in the richest country in the world.
And housing segregation in schools. The primary way that Americans pay for public schools is by paying property taxes. People who live in more valuable homes have better funded local schools, better paid teachers, better school facilities, and more resources. Here's the feedback loop. The better the schools in a neighborhood, the more those homes in that neighborhood are worth. And And the higher the property values of those homes, the more money there is for schools, and so on and so on. And housing segregation and health. Because of urban planning that benefited those richer, whiter neighborhoods, people of color are more likely to live near industrial plants that spew toxic fumes. They're more likely to live far away from grocery stores with fresh food, and in places where the water isn't drinkable. They're more likely to live in neighborhoods with crumbling infrastructure and in homes with toxic paint.
When you're living with rats, roaches, and things like that, that's the problem. You cannot have that kind of stuff with children running around in a building that may be full of lead.
And not coincidentally, people of color have higher incidences of certain cancers, asthma, and heart disease. And housing segregation in policing. Housing segregation means we are having vastly different experiences with crime and vastly different experiences with policing. Because our neighborhoods are so segregated, sometimes racial profiling can be camouflaged as spatial profiling, where living in certain areas can make you more likely to be stopped by the police. And it means that people have a lot of unnecessary contact with the criminal justice system just because of where they live.
The problem in our city, the police and the citizens are fighting. They keep targeting my brothers and sisters who don't really have nothing.
And that heavy, aggressive kind of policing that you see in black neighborhoods in particular makes people feel like they can't trust the police.
Oh, stop right here. I want to show you something. Now that's the city. Now we're gonna get an idea, a short version of what happens in the country.
When it comes to understanding financial inequality in this country, economists often point to the absence of African American generational wealth as one principal factor as resources pass from parent to child. As John Yang reports, for many African Americans, one source of the problem goes back decades.
Over the past century, African Americans have lost millions of acres of farms they owned across the South. It's a trend propelled not just by economic forces, but by white racism and local white political and economic power. It's not just a legacy of the Jim Crow South either. Most of the losses have occurred since the 1950s. That history and its lasting effects are the subjects of the cover story of the September issue of the Atlantic magazine. It's written by Van Newkirk, who's a staff writer at the magazine. Van, thanks for joining us tonight. What is important about this story? Why did you want to tell this story? What is important you think that people should know from it?
Well, right now the country is in the middle of a lot of debates over the racial wealth gap, over the status and economic prosperity or lack thereof of African Americans here, and also about reparations, perhaps. And I wanted to, with this piece, recenter the conversation on the South, on black folks in the South who often get left out of this conversation, on one of the places where the deficit has been the most extreme, and that's in farming and in the ownership of land.
You call this, the headline is the Great Land Robbery. What happened? Give us an idea of what happened.
So what happened was during, pretty much after the middle of the 20th century, federally funded farm programs, they were put out there to give small and middle-sized farmers loans, to support farms, to keep them going through bad economic times. They systematically disenfranchised and also discriminated against black farmers. So they didn't get the loan amounts, they were denied loans that they were entitled to, and often these local USDA programs were used as bully pulpits or forces to actually push black farmers off their land.
And some of this was actually accelerated or exacerbated as a result of the Civil Rights Movement, that this was a reaction to the Civil Rights Movement.
Right, so most of the USDA funding was actually leveraged through locally elected boards. And guess who could not vote in the South? So what would happen is these boards were dominated by the segregationists. And if you were a black farmer who needed money to grow your crops next year, one of the ways they could ensure you never joined the NAACP or never went out to vote or march against segregation was to hold that money in their hand and say, you're not getting this money unless you toe the company line. And so what they did to black farmers who didn't do that, who did go out and join the NAACP and these organizations, they took their money from them.
And you also talk about the lasting effects of this, not only the loss of sort of family wealth, but also the political effects.
Right. Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, these were states that were, if they weren't majority black going into the Great Depression and beyond, were close to being about half black. And what prompted the Great Migration, quote unquote, that saw millions of black people leave the South was the fact that a lot of them had their land stolen. Maybe, and I think this is probably what happens, if they hold on to that land, if they're able to make money in the South and vote in the South and have some type of stake in the future of their kids living in the South, perhaps those three states at least stay majority black. What happens to the Electoral College if we have three majority black states? What happens to the Senate? Yeah, those are big questions.
You told this story in part through a woman in her 60s now. She's the third generation of her family to be working the same farmland. The family was able to hold on to this land. Her name is Willena Scott White. And let's take a listen to a little bit of what she told me.
It's dear to me that my children know what my ancestors went through for us to be where we are and who we are. Because I'm a firm believer that if we don't know our history, then we repeat the mistakes over and over again.
Knowing her history, she says that families were denied their history by having their farmland taken away. Talk about that, the other effects of this, the impact it has on families.
Well, I talked to dozens of farm families for this story, and the reason why Willena's particular story and character got to me is because she's a historian. This is in her bones. She wants to build a museum in the Delta to honor not just her father and grandfather, but all the other farmers who came before her. I think she embodies the idea that what we're talking about here is not just money, not just the access to land, but the ability to put down cultural roots, to have a place to call your own. That's history, right? That's a thing that I do not believe we quite understand. It's lost when people are forced to move, when they are denied the ability to own the land under their feet. They are denied a bit of their history. And these people who live in the Delta now, black folks who live in the Delta now, they are in this place that was built with their hands and work that they are part of, but not allowed to actually hold to be part of.
You also talk in your story about how a lot of this land, through various transactions, is now held by pension funds, by venture capitalists, by hedge funds. You seem to hint that you think these transactions were somehow unethical?
I believe that it's possible through totally ethical means at this point, so many decades away from the original theft, to receive the land legitimately. You know, if you buy it from somebody who owned it and they don't have the lineage of the land, they don't know where it came from, that's a legal purchase. What I try to make the point of in the piece is that it probably doesn't matter whether an individual company got its land portfolio in a place where predominantly black folks lived and worked and should own the land. It doesn't really matter if they got it individual plots of land ethically or legally. What matters is that at some point the land was taken unethically and was taken away from these black folks illegally. What is our legal, ethical, moral responsibility as a people to rectify that?
Well,
And that is so true. And this is the reason why a lot of black people, you know, basically are part of reparations. Because these two videos show that the problem consistently, and it's a generational thing, that they experience from generation after generation, going back almost, 80 years with Jim Crow, with the first video, probably 60, 70 years, and you tack on another, 300 or 400 years with this video with the farmers. That's why it's about reparation. Because this is what the government did, and jealous people made it harder for people, these farmers, to succeed and do what they was taught from their ancestors. But yet America don't want to do right. And she still take away from the citizens who are descendants of slaves. All right then, ladies and gentlemen, till